Okay, so we're looking at the second question here. How does this extract develop the motif of Aschenbach's self-scrutiny? What is different in this extract to other moments where he attempts to justify his attraction to Tadzio, looking especially towards the end? So we're concerning ourselves with this passage that begins here, 3/4 of the way down, 249. A life of self-conquest and defiant resolve, and a stringent, steadfast and frugal life which he had turned into the symbol of that heroism for delicate constitutions, that heroism so much in keeping with the times. Surely he might call this manly, might call it courageous. And so he's, again, in this opening section here, engaging in this rationale that his life has been in some way this kind of Apollonian martyrdom of rigidity and repetitive rational effort. And it seemed to him that the kind of love that had taken possession of him did in a certain way suit and befit such a life, that actually in some way this passionate attraction to Tadzio somehow fits this attempt to be a martyr, because it requires a challenge. Had it not been highly honoured by the most valiant of peoples, indeed had he not read it in their cities, it had flourished by inspiring valorous deeds. He's talking, in the classical era, the great battles of Troy and deeds of this nature that are inspired by divine love. Numerous warrior heroes of olden times had willingly borne its yoke, for there was no kind of abasement that could be reckoned as such if the god had imposed it. And so there's, again, it can't be seen as immoral and degrading through this mythological lens, because it's, understanding that divine love has been in some way imposed by, the Greek gods in this classical mythological vision that he's attempting to draw himself into. And actions that would have been castigated as signs of cowardice had their motives been different, such as falling to the ground in supplication, desperate pleas, and slavish demeanour. These were accounted no disgrace to a lover, but rather won him still greater praise. We've got here this sort of stronger sense of narrative disdain here, I think, from the narrator, in terms of implicitly aligning Aschenbach with this kind of slavish, obsequious, weak demeanour that he seems, in his own thoughts, to be distancing himself from, and trying to draw attention to the connection between himself and actions of heroism. Such were the thoughts with which love beguiled him. And here's the kind of sense of critique here. There's the sense of negativity from the narrator, because love is the one beguiling him with these thoughts. And you can tell that they are not the product of the rationality that he is supposed to be, heroically dedicated to. And thus he sought to sustain himself. And so he sees again and preserve his dignity. And you can see there's a conscious effort on the part of this thinking, rather than a full immersion in these passages of thought. But at the same time, he kept turning his attention inquisitively and persistently to the disreputable events that were evolving in the depths of Venice, to that adventure of the outside world, which darkly mingled with the adventure of his heart, and which nourished his passion and vague and lawless hopes. And so at the same time as he's carrying out these acts of logical, acrobatic kind of justification, the narrator here is reminding us that he is constantly, inquisitively, and persistently focusing on the sort of dark passion that seems to be aligning him with the city of Venice in terms of its immorality and its degradation. He sees a kind of fellow sufferer in the realm of darkness because of Venice's greed. His own sort of sexual passion and greed seems to mirror that. And you can see the way it's rendered in darkly Dionysian terms. It's darkly mingled with the adventure of his heart, and it nourished his passion, vague and lawless hopes. So the differences here are that the narrator is deliberately prompting us to see the weaknesses in Aschenbach's thinking, and then reveals the real truth, which is that Aschenbach's justifications are all about persisting with his immoral attraction to Tadzio and the connection between himself and the place that he finds himself in. The next question is focused on 252, number 3. And it's asking us to examine the description of the guitarist playing on the Piazza San Marco, beginning on 252. And how is this characterization a development of the Dionysian character motif, that sort of stranger god motif that's repeated throughout the text? Importantly, he's a musician. So again, we've got that immediate suggestion of Dionysian artistic endeavor. It says he was a lean fellow, thin and cadaverous in the face as well. So he looks like a corpse. There's something deathly about him. A cadaver is a corpse. In the face as well, standing there on the gravel, detached from his companions, with a shabby felt hat on the back of his head. So he's got that straw felt hat, the component of that stranger god motif that we see numerous times throughout the text. The man in Munich, the passenger on the boat and the ferry. This is the third iteration of this exact feature of that particular character. And also the gondolier borrows several of these. It says, on the back of his head and a quiff of his red hair bulging out under the brim in a posture of insolent bravado. It says hair has got that redness that each of these characters seems to have, and he seems to be adopting a kind of a sense of power and kind of virile machismo that shows, I think, a component of Aschenbach's personality that is being coaxed out of him through this sort of Dionysian passion with Tadzio. It's strumming and thrumming on his instrument. He tossed his pleasantries up to the terrace in vivid parlando, enacting it all so strenuously that the veins swelled on his forehead. And again, that kind of the imagery of his face being used here, of his veins swelling on his forehead, gives us this sense of the man himself almost bursting with the dynamism and vitality of his art. This deeply Dionysian characterization. He was quite evidently not of Venetian origin, but rather of the Neapolitan comic type, half pimp, half actor, brutal and bold-faced, dangerous and entertaining. And the tensions in this man's description, it's important that they stereotypically ally him with Naples and make him sound, by virtue of that, some kind of seductive and brutal at the same time individual, containing these contradictions of sensuality and violence. The actual words of his song were merely foolish, but in his presentation with his grimaces and bodily movements, his way of winking suggestively and lasciviously licking the corner of his mouth, it had something indecent and vaguely offensive about it. So even though the words, the most Apollonian component of his song, are vague and meaningless, his own performance, his embodiment of this sort of passionate sexuality as he performs, gives it this connotation of Dionysian vitality that Aschenbach locates in several of the characters throughout the text, and that seem to be driving him towards his doom. Out of the collar of his sports shirt, his skinny neck projected, displaying a remarkably large and naked Adam's apple. There's some very obvious, stark reminder of his physical masculinity. His pallid, snub-nosed face again, and there it is again, that snub nose, the feature of the stranger god motif that's repeated numerous times, the features of which gave little clue to his age. So again, he seems to be kind of timeless. And it seemed to be lined with contortions and vice, and the grinning of his mobile mouth was rather strangely ill-matched to the two deep furrows that stood defiantly, imperiously, almost savagely between his reddish brows. And there it is again. It's the embodiment of this in some way disease, and it tracks Aschenbach's own state of degeneration, the gradually more sinister connotations of each of these stranger god figures. The man in Munich, the gondolier, the man on the boat, and then this one finally has a much more obviously starkly sinister and dangerous quality. That his face seems to be lined with contortions and vice, and that he carries this contradictory suggestion of happiness and menace. His grinning mouth contrasts with the deep furrows of his brow that seem to stand imperiously, almost savagely between his reddish brows, that suggestion of violence and threat and menace, and then the passion that's connoted by the colour red of his hair. But what really fixed the solitary Aschenbach's deep attention on him was his observation that this suspect figure seemed to be carrying his own suspect atmosphere about him as well. So he identifies some kind of connection with him by virtue of this suspect atmosphere. For every time the refrain was repeated, the singer would perform with much grimacing and wagging of his hand as if in greeting, a grotesque march round the scene, which brought him immediately below where Aschenbach sat, and every time this happened, a stench of carbolic from his clothes or his body drifted up to the terrace. So here he seems to be the embodiment of this sickness and disease that's plaguing the city, and that he seems in some way to be stirring up all of this sexual seduction and violent animosity that Aschenbach locates in himself and an external equivalent in the diseased cholera epidemic of Venice. Number 4 asks us to look at Aschenbach's description of the attraction towards Tadzio on 255 and how this description shifts the nature of his attraction from Eros to Thanatos. So how does it become more concerned with passionate love how does it become more concerned with mortality and deathliness than passionate love and sexuality and romance? So begins here. Aschenbach reclined in his chair no longer. He was sitting bolt upright as if trying to fend off an attack or flee from it. But the laughter, the hospital spell drifting towards him, and the nearness of the beautiful boy all mingled for him into an immobilizing nightmare, an unbreakable and inescapable spell that held his mind and senses captive. And we've got here, one of the principles of something Dionysian is the degeneration and breakdown of the boundaries between entities and the boundaries between individuals and experiences. And you look here at the intermingling of the senses, the laughter, the hospital smell, the visual pleasure of the beautiful boy mingling into an immobilizing nightmare. They merge in his mind into something that completely freezes his individuality and his reason, and that holds him captive, becomes an unbreakable and inescapable spell that holds him captive. So he loses complete control of himself here in this sensory admixture that seems to be represented by the smell, the laughter, and the pleasure of people watching the guitarist and the nearness of Tadzio. In the general commotion of distraction, he ventured to steal a glance at Tadzio, and as he did so, he became aware that the boy returning his glance had remained no less serious than himself, just as if he were regulating his attitude and expression by those of the older man, as if the general mood had no power over him while Aschenbach kept aloof from it. There was something so disarming and overwhelmingly moving about this childlike submissiveness. So again, he seems to be identifying with Tadzio, and he seems to suggest in some way that Tadzio is regulating his attitude and expression in the same way that Aschenbach is. He finds there's something overwhelmingly moving about his childlike submissiveness. I think there's something darkly sinister about this. There's something really threatening about the fact that Aschenbach finds it moving that Tadzio is so innocent and childlike and naive and submissive. It's so rich in meaning that the grey-haired lover could only with difficulty restrain himself from burying his face in his hands, almost in a sense of shame, but almost in a sense of explosive passion. So you've got this dual, ambiguous suggestion of Aschenbach's shame and lasciviousness, his sense of sexuality. He had also had the impression that the way Tadzio from time to time drew himself up with an intake of breath was like a kind of sighing, as if from a constriction of the chest. He's sickly. He'll probably not live long, he thought again, and with that sober objectivity into which the drunken ecstasy of desire sometimes strangely escapes. And his heart was filled at one and the same time with pure concern on the boy's behalf and a certain wild satisfaction. So we look at this, and there's a great odd sort of quality about this, that Aschenbach's taking greater thrill from the idea that Tadzio himself seems to be transient and on the cusp of some kind of physical degeneration or deathliness. He's sickly and he'll probably not live long. Now, this elevates beauty, this transience, because it reminds us that it's temporary. But in addition to this, it seems to be a kind of form of destruction, this desire for passion to mutate into a desire for destruction, which we see in Fight Club all the way through the text. And that we've got this suggestion here that the necessary logic of passionate intensity resolves itself in the destruction of the individual who has been overwhelmed by the passion. And we see that embodied very directly in the stranger God dream that ends, that occupies this ending paragraph of the text. So we've got this suggestion here that Eros naturally evolves into Thanatos. It evolves into the destruction of the person that it has in some way colonized. And again, it comes back to this exoticism, this suggestion of opening yourself up to otherness, the dark passions of your repressed psyche, in some way threatens to drive your passions, but at the same time overwhelm and destroy you as an individual. So we see this otherness in question 5 very directly articulated. So question 5 then says, how does this description other the disease of the cholera, and how might it connect to Aschenbach's inner state if we see the disease as the sort of object correlative of his internal degradation, the external objective correlation of his own internal state of degradation? So let's take a look at this passage. It's a sort of fascinating part of the text, this. For several years now, Asiatic cholera had been showing an increased tendency to spread and migrate. So there's this suggestion that this disease is non-European, it's other to Europe, and it shows threat through its tendency to make itself non-geographically specific. It's mobile and it can move around the globe, and it's the movement of it around the globe that makes it threatening. And the subtext of this is it's okay if it's causing chaos somewhere in Asia, non-European. It's originating in the sultry morasses of the Ganges Delta. And we think of this origin of the disease, this exotic, foreign, invading force of degradation and metaphorical corruption, as present in this early fantasy in the text, when he sees the stranger God for the first time embodied in the man in Munich, and his wild imagination conjures this sort of hallucinatory vision of something deliberately exotic, which he sees in that kind of sort of swampy fantasy that's dripping with kind of sexual connotations. Well, here the origin of cholera seems to be originating in a very similar setting. It's rising with mephitic exhalations. Mephitic means literally stinky gas. Of that wilderness of rank, useless luxuriance. There's this sort of hostile European perspective about the sensory luxuriance of the East here, and it being useless, just like his useless passion that his repressed German psyche won't allow him to embrace. That primitive island jungle shunned by man. So it's again a suggestion of a place that is forgotten by civilization, where tigers crouch in the bamboo thickets. And again, that threat of violent destruction is barely concealed in this vision. And again, it mirrors Aschenbach's earlier fantasy. The pestilence had raged with unusual and prolonged virulence all over northern India. It had struck eastward into China, westward into Afghanistan and Persia, and following the main caravan routes, it had borne its terrors to Astrakhan and even Moscow. Now, this is interesting because of Venice's state as a kind of trading city and a trading empire earlier in the 15th and 16th centuries as a sort of doorway into the East. And the caravan routes are those trading routes from the east to the west. But while Europe trembled with apprehension that from there the spectre might advance and arrive by land, it had been brought by Syrian traders over the sea. There's a real kind of subtext that allies itself to some of our current political context here about this fear of the East in some way infecting the West. And it comes back to Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, that in some way we define what is normal about us by defining the East as strange in contrast to ourselves. And this crops up again when we see this in Othello next year, and Venice as the setting of this, because Venice has this anxious status about, from sort of the perspective of sort of anxious Western civilization about it being in some way corrupted by the East. and then defining what is normal by virtue of the difference between East and West, saying that Europe is normal and secure and civilized by defining the East as strange. And that's precisely what's going on in the internal world of Aschenbach's psyche here. His Dionysian revelry, even though it's Greek in origin, has this sense of Asiatic otherness and exoticism, as if passion itself and all of the destructive potential that it contains in this text is something fundamentally anti-European, and the moral taint that is associated with it is a way of saying how moral and well-ordered and organized Europe appears to be. It had appeared almost simultaneously in several Mediterranean ports, raising its head in Toulon and Malaga, showing its face repeatedly in Palermo and Naples, and taking a seemingly permanent hold over Calabria and Apulia. And we look at these places, and you can tell even from the way that these places are envisioned in the current sort of, almost a kind of xenophobic fashion internally in Italy, as places that the North is kind of critical towards and skeptical towards because of their foreignness. They seem to only be partly European, and it's all those places that you hear hostile, stereotypical criticism of in even contemporary Italian political rhetoric. And so we've got this suggestion that this disease is in some way infecting Europe with its exoticism, in the same way that passion is infecting the rigid, ordered consciousness of the Germanic protagonist.